We are live. Welcome to Boston Basic Income. My name is Alex Howlett. This week's topic is the Chicago Boys. So this was a group of young economic students from Chile who went to University of Chicago starting in the late 1950s. And then they learned all about monetarism and free market economics. And they came back to Chile wanting to transform the Chilean economy. So they petitioned a presidential candidate in 1970. He didn't end up winning. And then there was a military coup that's pretty famous. Augusto Pinochet took over Chile and installed a military dictatorship. And then they were looking for an economic plan. And these guys were waiting for someone to ask, or actually they were kind of like going out there trying to sell it. And so these Chicago-trained Chilean economists, the Chicago Boys, basically got to design the Chilean economy how they wanted, because it was a dictatorship, and they basically got to say what went, and that's what went. And that was 1973, and Chile was under this military dictatorship until the year 1990, so 17 years. And their constitution, even today, is still the same constitution they had under that dictatorship. So they kind of smoothly transitioned into a democracy from a military dictatorship, which is, I guess it's not unheard of, but it's a little bit unusual. A lot of times you hear about these things just leading to more instability. So they managed to stabilize. These days, there is some political unrest in Chile, so we can get into that. So some of us read an article by Orlando Letelier, and he was the former Chilean ambassador to the United States under Allende, Salvador Allende, who is the president of Chile, who got overthrown in this coup. So obviously he's got a certain perspective. He has an opinion about how this went. And the article is entitled, it's in The Nation from 1976. It's entitled "The Chicago Boys in Chile, Economic Freedom's Awful Toll." So you can tell kind of what angle he's going to take. Unfortunately, Letelier was assassinated in Washington, D.C. In the month after this article was published. He was assassinated in a car bomb attack. This is maybe one of the last things he published. Yeah, so we might get into some quotes from the article, and we can talk about the Chicago Boys themselves. I'm admittedly not an expert on any of this stuff, as I'm often not an expert on the stuff we talk about, but I have a feeling that some people here might know more than I do. So we can talk about the people and what happened, and we can also talk about their economic plan and whether it makes sense. And if you were a dictator of a country and you had complete control, what economic policies would you put in place? Would you put in a basic income? What might have been different if they had basic income kind of in their minds as they were doing this? So all kinds of questions here. So I want to start by going around the room and getting people's initial thoughts on the Chicago Boys, the Chilean dictatorship, and their economic policy as it relates to basic income or not. So let's start with Richard, and then Kevin, and then Derek.
Well, if a basic income had been installed, like they mentioned in the article, that what was it, 25% of the population had no income coming in, and they were completely dependent on the church and.
So your audio, Richard, is still breaking up pretty bad, unfortunately. Yeah, but yeah, finish your point. Just be aware that yeah.
And charitable organizations, but if they had a basic income, there would have been the conditions for the people would have been far better, and they would have not as been dependent. They would have been able to possibly buy the overpriced milk and things.
Yeah, that's a good point. Having some money is better than having no money. Let's go to Kevin, Derek, and then Eddie.
Yeah, so I'm assuming I'm the only Kevin in this group right now. To be honest, I haven't had the time to read through the whole article, so I've only read about a third. But it seems to me, so I'm going to make a general statement and then talk about the what I thought about so far about the article that I read. So I think generally when people criticize or make critiques about certain economic policies or certain economic schools of views, it tends to focus on very narrow things. So for this particular case, two schools, classical liberalism or neoliberal school, neo-Keynesians, they criticize each other. But I think for layman's perspectives, it's like one is right and one's wrong, and they always have to pinpoint, oh, this particular thing didn't work, so this school must not work. So I kind of saw that in this article, which I think is it's categorically false. It's just absolutely just not the right way of looking at it, because two schools are right about certain things, they're wrong about certain things, and they complement each other. And I think in this particular case, he criticized these kind of free market, which again is a term most people don't seem to understand. Actually, free market capitalism criticized based on the things that actually happened in Chile, but when in fact, if you look at the facts, it was a mixed bag of things. There was definitely good effects of it, but there are also a lot of free market capitalism ideas that weren't implemented. As again, I think that's good social safety net, like basic income or negative income tax, and that's what contributed to the inequality of things. But again, I'm trying to keep this as general as possible right now. But I saw this article as an extension of focusing on a critique that just focuses on the wrong aspects of it and gives people the wrong impression. That was just the thought that I have. Yeah.
Okay, great. Let's go to Derek and then Eddie and then Martin.
I don't know too much about this period of history, and I'd really like to learn more about it, because I think in general, in developed countries' economies, we have a natural tendency we don't want to change things too dramatically. So when things do change dramatically in the world, it's really worthwhile to go and look carefully at what were the effects. It's like a trial experiment, really, for everyone else to take cues from. I sort of agree with some of the comments that were just made. The articles obviously has a very strong political perspective and wants to stress kind of these necessary connections between the policies that were implemented and political motivations. I don't know how helpful that is. I always, those two things are always there, and I find it more helpful to separate them. I think it's perfectly possible that Milton Friedman is just wrong about a lot of things, and maybe there were some of the things he was wrong about didn't work out so well here. That's possible. It doesn't have to be that there's a sort of secret motivation to prop up authoritarian dictatorships or something like that. From the economics I was able to glean from this article, there seem to be similar concerns, and I think he mentions it. There's similar concerns to the kind of stagflation in the U.S. and like how do you respond to that with monetary policy, and what are the disadvantages that occur when you try to curb inflation, right? And I think a lot of us would probably agree that it's really important to curb inflation in your economy. But if you have a basic income, then you have this wonderful safety cushion there, right? And if you don't have that there, then tightening monetary flows in your economy will definitely cause a lot of hardship and suffering. So that's my general take so far.
Okay, good stuff. Let's go to Eddie, Martin, and then Dan.
So I think one of the very big detriments of the way economics kind of gets too involved with politics a little bit is that there is a lot of kind of conflation, like people put everything in one bag. And so if you're a Keynesian, then you're for stimulus. And if you're a monetarist, then you're for discipline and you're an inflation hawk. One of the things that I think is a very important distinction is that there's more than one way to stimulate, and there's more than one way to be disciplined. So, for example, if you are if you're for the poor, if you put Keynesians on the left and monetarists on the right, and then you put the poor on the bottom and the wealthy on the top. If you want to be disciplined, you don't necessarily have to cut programs for the poor. You can actually cut programs for the rich. So you could actually reduce deficit spending, reduce fiscal policy, by taxing the rich more. You can put on, luxury tax. You can tax businesses. You can do more taxation at the top to reduce fiscal deficits and be more disciplined. Because my impression of this situation in Chile in the 70s, it looks to me like, just simply, it looks to me like a worldwide phenomenon in the 70s with inflation and stagflation the entire world over. It was not a situation that was specific to Chile, but on the other hand, it was quite serious in Chile. The inflation went up to 700% a year at the very peak. And I think that is due very much to, with different countries, each having their own currency, these things tend to hit different countries differently. And so if you have a small country based on its size and based on what capital flows are doing, that may exaggerate the effect on a particular country. If investors are fleeing Chile at this time, then that's going to drive the currency down, even relative to everybody else, and make the inflation even worse. Those are my initial thoughts.
Okay, good stuff. And certainly the idea of taxing the rich a lot is kind of the opposite of what the free market monetarists and the Chicago boys were kind of promoting in their plan. So we can get into that more later too. Let's go to Martin, Dan, and then Austin.
So I did reading the article I posted in the meetup, and it added a little thing to the chat here. This notion of shock therapy, and the same description was applied in Russia with the advice from Jeffrey Sachs and principally some other folks from Harvard in ostensibly helping the transition in Russia from the Soviet system to a more capitalist system. And the point I'll make is in both cases, the idea of shock therapy had a political element, the political element being ensuring that the system did not go back to what it was. Anyway, so I'll just make that. I mean, I could make a lot of observations, but I'll just make that one, that the intertwining of politics and economics can be very strong in a way where the absolute economics are not quite as important as just making sure you get away from where you were. And that's a political thing. And I would almost say in both cases, it proved to be counterproductive because you're so worried about what you're trying to get away from that you're less likely to be more incremental and be a little bit, for lack of a better word, a little bit more reflective along the process and making incremental adjustments because you're really bound to this sort of political approach.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point. And it's also interesting to notice how incremental Chile has been since then. Everything's been incremental since the 1970s. So we can get into that more too. Let's go to Dan, Austin, and then Bethany.
Yeah, so I read just a little bit of the article. So my comments are fairly general as well. I think as much as we might try to separate politics and economics, I don't fundamentally think they can be separate. I think almost, at least from me paying attention, it seems that almost every political decision has some effect on the economy in some form or fashion. Even things that we might consider more social in nature and not necessarily economically focused. So maybe we could talk about that. And then I guess my other comment is just about the whole free market ideology, and free market ideology and just ideology in general. I think it becomes really counterproductive when we say that this particular policy or framework is this and not that. And it's just, we should focus on, is this a good idea or is this a bad idea? And I think a lot of the issues that are probably raised in this article and that are applicable to the present and into the future are getting out of this like ideological food fight and just focusing on what actually works. Like, for instance, not focusing on how do we make like a private health insurance better, but saying, should healthcare be in the private marketplace or not? That's like, to me, that's the more fundamental type of question we should ask about all our politics and all our economics. So those are just some initial thoughts about that.
Yeah, I like your point about once you start putting labels on things, people attack the labels instead of the underlying ideas. Let's go to Austin, Bethany, and then Joan.
Hey guys. I really don't know where to start with this. I have a billion things I'd like to say about this, so I'll make sure I don't. My number one thing was that I wanted to say is, okay, so when Alex was talking about, he says, okay, so the economists were trained in Chicago, right? But he doesn't talk about where the military guys were trained. The guys who ran the military coup were also trained in the United States. So it's not this narrative where this thing happens in Chile and, there just happen to be these dudes who happen to study at Chicago, who happen to be there, and they think, let's try them. There's some, local guys who've got ideas. This is all, they're part of the same political organism to an extent, which is the oligarchy in South America is closely tied to external powers, Spain, United States. There's social connections at the top. People at the top tend to be white and have European heritage. People at the bottom tend to be dark and have indigenous or slave heritage, right? This is all like, it all happens in the same social fabric. So this idea of separating the political or the military side of things from the economic side of things, to me, isn't useful. It's especially, in fact, in this kind of example, it's specifically counterproductive, right? Like sometimes it might be good to have a theoretical conversation where you just want to isolate, macroeconomic pressures or whatever. But to understand what's happening in Chile, I don't think you can. Like the example of Russia came up and how the same tactics were applied there. And the idea was that, we didn't reflect on the outcomes we were getting doing this, when it's like, well, you already had the example of Chile, you already had and the other examples, right? This is the same story as Jakarta. This is the same, this is the same story as what happened in Indonesia with the end of the Sukarno regime and the beginning of the Suharto regime. This is the same story that you see in, in Egypt with the transition to Sadat and the bread riots of the 70s. You see the same pattern you see all over the world, where the imperial center imposes this politics of austerity and inequality on the peripheral countries. And my tendency is to think that there might be some like true believers, like that the Chicago boys are just useful idiots. The real smart people are the Keynesians in the Pentagon who know that this won't work. And you want to keep everybody, like when you're in a power struggle, you want everyone else to be weak so you can be strong. Right. And so when you have a chance to cut someone else off at the knees, you do it because it's the law of the jungle. That's international relations. Right. So international relations is actually what's driving this. And the economic policy is a means that's used in that struggle. Right. And and so you've got this globally connected elite, right, preying in a predatory way on their own population and selling the excess value that they can extract from nature and from their own population into the global market, right? And Allende, the democratically elected leader, wanted to mess with that and he got murdered, right? And this is where, the connection between economic politics and violence to me is writ really large. Final note: Hitler, since I'm going for the full scale rant. No, two massive things. One, if we can't learn anything about free market economics by looking at Chile, then we can't learn anything about communism or socialism from looking at the Soviet Union, right? And if we can't, and the other thing I'll say is Hitler once said that socialism was the necessary outcome of democracy. So that's why it had to be stopped, right? And that's basically the same idea you see motivating all of these right-wing coups. I mean, they're still happening. They're still just happened in Bolivia, right? Where there was the military threatened the life of the elected leader and he resigned and fled to Mexico, right? That just happened last year. So what happens is we cut off these countries at the knees. We don't allow them to run sensible economic management. We send in these mad people. I mean, Australia's just as bad. We did it with East Timor, but anyhow, that's a whole other story. We just do it with the countries that are small enough to be bullied by us. Anyhow, so this is a case of power politics setting the economic agenda and reflecting its values.
Okay, yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot of interesting stuff there. Certainly, there is this element of, the coup being backed by the CIA and U.S. interests and that kind of thing. I don't know how far I buy into, the people in Washington or at the Pentagon knowing that monetarism wasn't going to work in Chile and therefore encouraging it or something like that. But I do know that before the coup, there were efforts to disrupt the Chilean economy by the United States and to cause inflation. Like they, blocked exports and stuff like that to really interfere with the economy. And then that helped them boost their story that that their economic system was not a good economic system. It helped rally support against the regime. So there's certainly a lot of that kind of stuff going on. But even independent of that, yeah, go ahead.
I was being a little bit facetious when I make it that simple that they're actually Keynesian secretly plotting to hurt Chile by doing this. There's layers to it, right? There'd be some people who are thinking, but my point is that I think the geopolitics drives the economics in a lot of cases, like especially the Russia case. That's sort of an extreme example.
Well, I think you're right that the geopolitics does drive the economics and certainly the shock therapy thing. But, there's still a useful question we could ask, which is that if the geopolitics is going to cause a coup in Chile and we want them to have a good economic system, to what extent was this plan a useful plan that was helpful to the Chilean economy? To what extent was it not? And we can kind of evaluate that independent of the politics. We can look at, okay, well, this, removing all tariffs and controlling inflation and causing high unemployment or something like that, what are the costs and benefits of these kinds of things, and what about basic income if you had basic income in the mix, that kind of thing.
Can I say one more thing on that note before I shut up for a bit? Then I think this group runs the risk of falling into the left-wing caricature of basic income, because it's like, oh well, if we had basic income, then everything would have been fine and we don't have to confront these other deeper injustices. We don't have to worry about the fact that they were taking, teachers and breaking their fingers and murdering them and throwing them out of planes into the sea. And we don't have to worry about people being tortured in sports stadiums. And we don't have to worry about American power. And we don't have to worry about, all these terrible things. Because if we just have basic income, that's going to solve all the problems and it'll be fine, right? So there's a real risk of falling into a bit of a trap where you have this panacea and it's used as a way for people who are generally sympathetic to the current order to avoid more thoroughgoing and structural change. Now, I don't think that's the case. I think you give people a basic income, they're going to get more bolshy. They're going to become more difficult to control and have greater political leverage, like the Whitequist argument, right?
Sure.
But framing the discussion in a way where it's like, well, let's just leave out all the oppression, let's leave out all the anti-democratic elements and just talk about the economics. I think we have to be very careful that doesn't become a shallow and callous view of the topic.
Yeah, I think that's right. We do need to be careful about that. So let's move on to Bethany and then Joan and then David.
Hey, so I guess two things. One, on this note of how to disentangle economics and politics, I'm interested in how much we can answer your question, Alex, like given some of the confounds you mentioned, that people were kind of like meddling with the economy and there may have been political influences on how well the economy did afterwards too, internationally. and nationally. So I'm interested in knowing, what we can learn from this experiment in terms of economic policy, but I'm also aware that these like political confounds might make it difficult to see how it would apply in a different situation, how the principles would. And sort of relatedly, and a little bit related to Austin's comments, I think you had mentioned before to me, Alex, offline, that the US tried to implement some of these same things later. And so that might suggest that it wasn't at least something that everybody thought would be a failure. And so maybe there were other motives that companies wanted Chilean companies to be doing well or something like that. But I'm interested in exploring whether we can learn something from maybe that contrast to like how these things went in the US versus Chile when the same principles tried to be implemented.
Yeah, that's right. So this happened in the 1970s, and then the US and the UK, of course, with Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher, they started adopting some of this monetarist stuff too. They weren't doing not quite as much. They weren't doing this kind of shock therapy approach. Maybe there's some argument to be made that Paul Volcker was a form of shock therapy for monetary policy or something like that. But yeah, it was approached with there was no military coup and there was no sudden transition in the United States or the UK. But certainly they looked at Chile as a blueprint for the kinds of things that they would, now that they've tried it down there, we can do it in the United States, that kind of thing. And then there's an extent to which it didn't quite work out the way we wanted it to here either. So we can talk about that as well. Go ahead, David.
I like what Austin talked about. He talked more about the geopolitical stuff than what my thinking was. But when I read the article, I thought, that the author had the right of things, that in a way it's impossible to separate your political policies and your political motivations from an economic policy. And that if I was in a position of overthrowing a democratically elected official, in a military coup, I would want to share my power with as few people as possible. And a good way to do that would be through some kind of a shock therapy type thing, where I'm not sure that basic income, certainly not a natural rate of basic income, which would share the wealth and access to resources most broadly, would be an effective way of maintaining a tight control on power structures. So as long as your goal is to create stability so that commerce can take place by having tight controls, military control of the government, I don't think it's possible to widely share the benefits of the economy. A lot of us come to this discussion about basic income from this idea that if the economy works best when it works for the broadest number of people, creates the greatest good for the greatest number of people. But I think if you're running a military dictatorship, that's not how you would see things. You would see your economic policy working best when it funds your military. And you wouldn't need to fund the military through a large number of people. You would actually want to fund your military through just a small group of very profitable enterprises, which is, I think, what they accomplished by doing this.
Okay, yeah, I think that's a good point. So we can ask, is the military dictatorship looking for an economic policy that will just help sustain their power? There's reason to believe that maybe that's what they would be thinking, and that's what they would be looking for. And even if the Chicago boys are useful idiots or something, and they're true believers in what they're saying, there's a reason why they picked that group of true believers and not a group of true believers in some other kind of economic policy that would be less amenable to continued military dictatorship. But I know, that's not how Milton Friedman thought about it. Milton Friedman said that the miracle of Chile was that the military dictatorship was embracing an economic policy that would ultimately lead to its own demise. So he believed that free markets led to free societies. And he thought it was a miracle that Pinochet wanted to implement a policy that would undermine his own military dictatorship. So he really believed in that. And he used the analogy, when people criticized him for helping out Pinochet and helping out the military dictatorship. He said, like, if there's a military dictatorship that's having some kind of health crisis or something like that, and you send in doctors to, help their people survive better and be healthier and that kind of thing, are you going to criticize those doctors for helping that society? And he really believed that, what the Chicago Boys were doing was something that helped the Chilean society and helped the Chilean economy, despite the kind of oppressive military dictatorship. So that's kind of something to keep in mind in terms of just, everybody who's involved in this has kind of a different perspective on what they believe is going to work. And then, like, you can ask why Pinochet wanted to have a military dictatorship and to what extent he believed, what the United States, wanted, and to what extent he just wanted power, that kind of thing. So there's all kinds of questions here. Go ahead, Austin.
Yeah, I just wanted to follow up with what people are saying in terms of, you do the economic policy that allows you the greatest power if you're a dictatorship. So there's a sort of Caesarean route there, where what you do is you say, well, I am a demagogue and I am going to give a basic income to everyone in the population, and you're going to back me against the senatorial class, right? So you can imagine a figure like that emerging who uses basic income as any kind of economic populism as a way of giving themselves power that comes from the demos, from the mass of people supporting them against the entrenched institutional power. So there is one way that you can imagine a populist economic policy, right, fueling a demagogue, right, which is, I think, something that the United States has to keep its eyes open for at the moment. But and in that situation, some blame has to fall on the senatorial class that left the people to rot, But what happened in Chile and what happens in the third world is not that. It's what happens in the general pattern in the third world. There are exceptions. Is that you have these oligarchic elites who take control, and their power is enforced through these personal networks are really important, right? Like the general's daughter marries the judge's son, and then when the case comes to trial where they murdered all those villagers, somehow they get off, right? So you have these closed circles at the top of power where there's access, and it's almost like a mafia society is what happens, right? There's the shadow of a government over the top, but underneath there's a mafia that's actually running things, right? And in Egypt, that's one of the ways but it also becomes quite direct. Like in Egypt, the military owns businesses, right? So the military owns like half the chicken production. The military owns half of, it makes kitchenwares and tiles and all this stuff for houses, right? Like they dominate the local economy. Like you can't generals own businesses and then get conscript soldiers to go work in them for free. So there's this complete merge of economic and military power. It's kind of like a naked version of what's going on elsewhere, right? But there's also a rule that I've read somewhere, and I think someone actually did a study on this. I'm not sure, but they said, okay, as you cut the social elements of a country, the more you cut the social spending, the popular economic support, subsidies, job creation programs, that kind of stuff, the more you have to expand the military and the police and the prison system, right? So the government doesn't actually shrink, is the argument in Pinochet. There wasn't a small government in Pinochet's Chile. It was huge. It had, police cars and tanks and in Egypt, again, the example I know quite well, there's a popular meme where people share photos of the ambulances that the government has, which are shitty and falling apart, and then photos of the armored cars that the police come to arrest protesters in, right? And they say there's no money to heal you, but there is money to kill you, right? There's the less a government spends on social services, the more it has to spend on coercion and building up its enforcement arm. So again, the politics and the economics and social elements are all really tied together in this sort of Gordian knot of power.
Okay. Yeah. So, I mean, my hope is that today we can untangle certain parts of that knot. We don't have to solve the whole puzzle. But yeah, it is tricky because how do you look at one part of it without looking at the other parts too? And Kevin is pointing out a small correction in the chat. He's saying that Friedman argued that economic freedom is a prerequisite to political freedom, but not sufficient to lead to political freedom by itself. So I think that's a good point too. So certainly it's the case, or I guess the question we could ask is, can you even have free markets if you don't have a free society? And I think people who look at Chile, especially if they look on it as an example of successful economic policy, they would say yes, you can have free markets even if your society is under a military dictatorship or something like that. Let's go to David. You have your hand up. I'm not sure if it's left over from before.
It might have been, but yeah, I guess I can add this that I think that that the part of the miracle of Chile is stability, and that you can have, as long as you're able to impose a stable government and a stable economic structure, you're likely to have some prosperity and economic output be produced by that, and then from an economic perspective, that stability is a necessary, maybe a necessary good, necessary prerequisite as well.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. Stability is kind of half the battle, right? If you're unstable, then it doesn't really matter what your principles are. And if you are stable and you can maintain that stability, then that's a foundation you can build on. And I think Chile has built on that foundation. Let's go to Dan.
Yeah, just as everybody's talking, I'm just sort of thinking, it seems like basic income is sort of antithetical to any kind of authoritarian or dictator-like government. We're talking about Chile potentially, like what if basic income was a part of the equation in Chile, as prescribed by the Chicago Boys or whatever it is, if it was something that would have influenced them, because it seems like it democratizes both, economic power, but also political power, in that when you have a populace that can work less, can be more politically engaged and things like that, they might vote for things that are that decentralize power even more, as opposed to a situation that seems to persist in many countries today, where you have a large portion of the population that, for many reasons, like they have to work on an election day or things like that. There's this idea that when your economic survival is conditional upon your ability to work, and there isn't that space to be as politically engaged, that's a recipe to keep power centralized, and can lead to some of the things that Austin was mentioning about, populist rhetoric and things like that, because people feel helpless, and I think, to the extent that a country keeps its citizens poor, no matter what the political structure is, that's always a problem. And so basic income doesn't do that, but by virtue of not doing that, it gives people more political agency to have greater control, greater political power, and greater control over the direction of a particular country.
Yeah, I think you're bringing up some interesting points, Dan. And one of them is that if you give people more freedom to be politically active, and they want to be politically active, then they're gonna be more politically active. But basic income has this other aspect to it, which is that it makes people better off. If you're living life and everything's great, then you have less reason to want to overthrow the government. So it's kind of both. It gives you more freedom to overthrow the government, but less of a cause to want to do that. So it's hard to know kind of how those two forces balance out. But in general, I would say that if everybody's happy and living like healthy, prosperous lives, there's not really a need to overthrow the government in the first place. Now, if you're accomplishing that through a dictatorship, through like a pure military, iron fist rule or something like that, then I guess that would be something interesting to look at, because my intuition tells me, and I think a lot of people's intuition tells them, that you can't have a truly free and prosperous society under those conditions, under like an absolute dictatorship. So that would be something we'd have to think about if it ever happened. Let's go to Kevin.
Thanks. So I think there are a couple of points that people have been touching upon, and here's my understanding of what happened in Chile. So all this installation of the so-called free market capitalistic ideas, or some parts of it, without the social safety net that's also suggested by free market capitalism or Friedman and the likes, which wasn't there. But so all this, from my understanding, all this economic policies, deregulations, privatization of certain nationalized industries, all that resulted in huge economic growth. So that's undeniable. Huge boom of the a good business environment where people can do business and succeed. Middle class, booming middle class. But I think at the same time, there were a couple of things, couple industries that were privatized kind of the wrong way. Again, free market capitalism doesn't mean zero regulation. It means minimum regulation where you can play the game fairly for everyone. You make the game fair for everyone. But I don't think that was the case in Chile in certain industries, particularly in what I know is that another thing they kind of screwed up was education. People can argue different things about this, but I think essentially what happened was there's just not enough money going into education, so they have to raise tuitions one way or the other. So I think that's all things that attributes to, from what I know, those are the things that actually attributed to Chile's sort of social instability or some parts of its inequality as well. So I think that's where, again, free market capitalism or all the neoliberalism kind of gets a bad rep from all those things. But because, the weird thing is, again, like people haven't tried the neoliberal idea of social safety net, which is, again, basic income or things like negative income tax.
We never tried real communism either. Sorry.
Yeah. Well, it's impossible, right? Real communism is absolutely impossible.
Well,
right?
I think
there's no such thing as real communism. That's why it failed, because of human nature. And I think psychologists are papers about this why it failed.
Yeah, I think you could certainly make that theoretical argument, and I probably would kind of be in that camp and make that argument. But it's also, you can't really ever have a pure anything. So anytime anyone criticizes whatever economic framework you're the biggest fan of, you can always say, well, we've never actually tried it, tried a real X, real blank, whatever blank is. And sometimes that blank is basic income too, right? Like I've had people come to me and say, anytime anyone has tried basic income, it's failed or led to hyperinflation or, caused the economy to collapse or something like that. And then I have to say, well, we haven't actually tried a real basic income, but now I'm doing what all the, communists are doing and all the neoliberals are doing, basically you can attack anyone's plan by saying that. And then the person can come back and say, well, we've never really tried it for real. But I think, we can go deeper, we can dig deeper.
I can comment on it a little bit. So when I say real free market capitalism, it's not some ideal that people uphold. It's, just generally deregulating the environment or deregulating the parts of industries and having a social safety net. That's it. It's plausible. But so what I'm talking about is communism or some kind of perfect idealism is, I'm going to compare it to sandwiches. It's like sandwich. You can't have a perfect sandwich. You can't. What's your idea of perfect sandwich? But it's impossible. You can't have it. But you can have like a Reuben sandwich, right? But then what I'm talking about is let's compare free market capitalism to a Reuben sandwich. You need roast corned beef. You need sauerkraut. You need Russian dressing. You need rye. And what happens is what happened in most places is that you make the Reuben sandwich without the what do you call it? Without the rye bread and the sauerkrauts. You put sourdough and you put pickles. That's not Reuben, but people call it Reuben because it's corned beef. It must be Reuben sandwich. Oh, I hate this stuff. That's what happened without the social safety nets, really.
Yeah, and I think we can talk more about what a real kind of like neoliberal reform would have looked like that actually had like all of the appropriate ingredients. And we can also talk about whether whether basic income would have been part of that. And my intuition is that it wouldn't have. I know that Milton Friedman talked about a negative income tax, but he also talked about consolidating the entire safety net into a negative income tax and then removing the negative income tax as like the final step. So I've seen kind of both steps of that. So I don't know if my sense is that something like basic income or negative income tax was not in the minds of the Chicago boys or any of the Chicago economists as a kind of part of the end game. Maybe it was in some of the plans of how to get to where they wanted to be. You'd see something like that, but I don't know that it would be in the final plan. Yeah.
So if I may say another thing, I think that's interesting because in historically a lot of countries where they, regardless of how they did economic growth. I mean, Korea is a whole different case. Singapore is a different case. Hong Kong, completely different case of how they brought up economic growth. But if you look at it, it always starts by, hey, we're dirt poor. We have nothing. Let's at least have something on the table for people, and then let's worry about inequality.
Right.
So I think the same thing kind of happened in Chile. I don't know if there are enough speculations or economic models out there that says, oh, achieving both at the same time is possible or not. So I think that's an interesting thing, and hence maybe that's why things like negative income or basic income or other types of social safety nets weren't in the minds of the Chicago boys. Maybe.
Yeah, it's possible. I also think that the Chicago boys didn't necessarily understand the implications of some of their policies. So, for example, when they tightened monetary policy in Chile and tried to control inflation, which they kind of succeeded at doing, it caused a lot more unemployment than they were expecting it to. They were not expecting it to cause unemployment. They were expecting, if you have a stable currency, the markets become more efficient, and then that's going to lead to higher employment and stuff like that. So certainly, there's elements of all these things, in terms of the stuff they were planning for and hoping for. Maybe they didn't get all of it, but even in some of the stuff they did do, maybe didn't have some of the outcomes they thought it would. And then there was also kind of disagreement among them as well. There was, what was it? There was something that they implemented in Chile, which Milton Friedman said was wrong. I forget what it was, but it might have had something to do with tariffs or something like that. I'm not sure. But anyway, I think this is a good segue into the first quote that I want to get to. I know a few people have their hands up, but I'll get to you guys after the quote. So let's get to it here. So these are the basic basic principles of the economic model offered by Friedman and his followers and adopted by the Chilean junta. And actually, I just want to say right here, as we read this, we can think about whether Letelier is kind of building a straw man of what their plans were. I'm not sure that if you ask the Chicago boys what their basic principles were, if this would be reflective of that. So here's the principles that Letelier says they were going after. So that the only possible framework for economic development is one within which the private sector can freely operate. That private enterprise is the most efficient form of economic organization, and that therefore the private sector should be the predominant factor in the economy. Prices should fluctuate freely in accordance with the laws of competition. Inflation, the worst enemy of economic progress, is the direct result of monetary expansion and can be eliminated only by a drastic reduction in government spending. So there's kind of a lot here, and some of it I agree with and some of it I don't. I certainly am not a fan of inflation. But is it true that they believed that did they have this kind of market fundamentalism where if you have a choice between the government and the market, you always have to choose the market? And my sense is that no, that they understood that there was a role of government for some things, But in terms of where they drew the line, I'm sure they drew the line somewhere where Letelier was not happy with. So let's get to some people's comments here. Let's go to Austin next.
Hey, I just wanted to, couple of things. Someone mentioned stability, right? And there's this idea that, oh, well, you know, there was economic growth once Pinochet took power and there was stability. It's like, well, that's because the most powerful nation in the world was no longer trying to bring their government down. Like, you can't have stability when the CIA has decided your government needs to fall. And it's doing, as you said before, economic sabotage, political sabotage. Let's remember the guy who wrote this article was killed, you know, along with 40,000 other people. This is not a situation that's your stability then, right? Your stability comes from, in part, the fact that you use terror to crush political dissent and opposition, right? So I think stability is a little bit overrated, and it's not fair to sort of say, well, the Allende government couldn't have had a stable government or couldn't have had economic growth when the reasons for that were external, right? And so someone's saying we can't compare, you know, neoliberalism to communism because one's, you know, a real world thing, the other one's an ideal system. Well, they are both, you know, theories on paper, right? Then neither of them is a real country. What we have to compare is the Allende government and the Pinochet government. That's the comparison that you make. And we don't know what would have happened with the Allende government, but we do have other analogs. Like, I would say people should look at what's happened in Ecuador and Bolivia and Uruguay and Brazil under Lula da Silva, where you have had center-left populist third world governments create massive increases in like life expectancy and, you know, cutting child malnutrition and all of these things, which someone like Andrew Yang would say we should measure, right? If you look at those metrics, not just economic growth, if you look at those metrics that the Yang Gang put forward as like we should be looking at, you know, mental health and, you know, birth weights and all of these real human measurements, a lot of center-left governments, like the Allende government that was thrown out of power, have runs on the board, right? That we can quantify. It's not just this theoretical abstract thing, right? And the idea that all economic growth has come from the free market is, I think, historically inaccurate, as someone was saying. I mean, the Industrial Revolution in England, I'm not going to go all the way back, but like there's been government and state-led growth throughout the history of modern economies. It's not something where, you know, it's not this fable of, you know, a marketplace happening in a vacuum generating all of this growth. There's a huge role for the state. The state is never neutral. It has to choose what kind of economy. And when you hear about someone raising fees to go to university, that's also a reflection of a class idea that certain people should go to university, certain people from certain families, not other ones. And you see that a lot, right? Like in Egypt, there was recently a law that if you want to be a judge, your parents have to have been lawyers. Right, and that's the kind of thinking that dominates these third world societies, right?
Austin, I'm going to go ahead and interrupt you at this point, but I think you are making some good points, but I do want to kind of direct the discussion, you know, like keeping everything you're saying in mind, direct the discussion toward, you know, on top of all of the things you're saying are wrong, are there things that are inherently wrong with the economic plan as well? Is kind of a question that I want us to.
Raising university fees, for example,
sure,
right?
Sure.
Like, and this is what I'm saying is that that there's this idea that somehow the economic system is free of all this political contamination, which keeps coming up in the way people discuss it, and I keep feeling the urge to push back.
I don't think anyone is saying that it's free of political contamination, but what we can ask is, if I want to politically contaminate an economic system, and I have a certain idea of how I want to contaminate that system and what I want my contamination to cause, am I still getting some things wrong, right?
Yeah, well, I would disagree with all of it. I would disagree with all of it, top to bottom, pretty much. I would have voted Allende, right? I would have been one of the people who got dragged off and killed because I still would have been on the corner promoting that set of economic policies.
Yeah, I mean, I think there are a lot of really valid criticisms for the Allende, you know, economic system as well. And I think there are flaws there that aren't just caused by interference by the United States and the CIA. So we could talk about that as well. But I don't think either economic system was perfect. But in terms of who I would have voted for, I probably wouldn't vote for a military dictator, but I wouldn't need to because he'd just take over anyway. So let's go to Bethany.
Yeah, a couple things. One is from a while ago when we were talking about how basic income influences political participation. And I just wanted to raise the question of whether we can learn anything from the fact that oftentimes, at least in certain historical circumstances, like political changes have been led by people in kind of like a middle class or an upper middle class. I don't know if that suggests that something like having more resources might push you sometimes towards more political participation. But that was one thought. And then more relevant to what we've now been talking about, I'm wondering if you can kind of summarize for us, Alex, because this article has a particular perspective, kind of summarize what you see as the main pros and cons kind of how things went under the new regime, like economic policies in Chile. And that could be sort of in contrast to what came before as well. Because I think, like I said, the article, obviously it's got one point of view. So I'm curious kind of what you or maybe other people think of like the sort of key pros and cons that came out of it. Another change.
Yeah, so I think the big thing that happened that was good was that they did get inflation under control. Unfortunately, we talk a lot here about expecting people to get their income from jobs. Unfortunately, if you get inflation under control by tightening a monetary policy, it eliminates a lot of jobs. And if people are depending on jobs for their income, that's a bad thing. So kind of all else being equal, not having excessive inflation is a good thing. But if your economy is kind of depending on excessive inflation day to day, and you want your currency to be depreciating to fuel your export industry and keep people employed and stuff like that, that's going to be a problem if you end inflation without kind of creating a substitute for a lot of that kind of stuff. So a lot of people were left out of work. They also, at the same time, dropped tariffs on imports. So now domestic producers in Chile had to compete with imports. And they often weren't able to produce things that were cheaper than the imports. So then there are a lot of people who traditionally made things that was just unnecessary. It became unnecessary because it could be imported for cheaper. So this is, maybe this could even be an analogy to kind of automation taking away people's jobs, like the previous workers are not able to compete, or just outsourcing that we have in the United States too, like we import a lot of stuff. But if you really need your people to have jobs and you're kind of you've had this infrastructure in place that kind of like promotes employment and keeps people working and that kind of thing, and then you kind of undermine that, then you've got a problem. So I think there's kinds of both pros and cons built in there. I heard someone say something to me once about like kind of if you implement a plan halfway, that can have a worse effect, sometimes have a worse effect on people than not implementing it at all, even if the full plan would be better. Maybe that had something to do with unions or something like that. That maybe unions are efficient in a world where the labor market is structured the way it is, or something like that, even though it's not in kind of a perfect free market world or something. So I guess that's that. I think one of the biggest benefits, I know Austin is not sold on the stability argument, but the fact that they transitioned into a democracy is and stayed, kind of a healthy economy for a long time. That's certainly an upside to all of it. So Diane is bringing up in the chat that poverty in Chile drastically increased under Pinochet, at least at the beginning. I think later on it actually decreased a lot. So it's interesting because it wasn't just like you went from one thing to another thing and then it was this kind of uniform thing for a long time. Even after they had their new economic policy in place, you'd have these, recessions and booms and stuff like that, just like any economy would. So depending on which time period you look at, it's going to be different.
Hey, Alex.
Yeah.
Hey. Hi.
Hey.
I figured I would just not focus on typing and just talk.
Yeah, there you go.
Yeah. Hey everybody. So yeah, so I just to make sure that it's understood, like that in the chat, I'm not coming into the conversation assuming that that this school of thought de facto led to the increased poverty. I'm just pointing out that did occur. I'm not, whether or not it's because there were flaws in the thinking of these gentlemen, I'm not necessarily saying that. And
actually, Diane, you were just sending those messages to me. It wasn't going to the whole chat.
Oh, okay, cool. So basically, I had pointed out in the chat that poverty went up, and I think that Kevin said in the chat that, well, that depends on what poverty is. Well, I mean, for purposes of this conversation, I think that we can just, instead of getting in the weeds about whether or not they were really poor or not, I think that we can assume that if one of the indicators, like I've read that one of the indicators of people that found themselves in this situation in Chile, the reason that they had to institute a lot of reforms on top of after the coup was because as poverty went up very precipitously, and you're asking, well, how are we defining poverty? They were defining it as like life-threatening situations of, people that, there was, I remember a statistic that said that like 12% of the population was so destitute that they could not afford to pay a rent, not even in the cheapest part of town in Santiago. So if you can't afford the basics of life, one of which is, to not be homeless, that I would say that we can trust that they actually were poor. I realize that sometimes in these conversations we start to talk about relativism as far as like, well, there are poor people who have TVs and that kind of stuff, but we're talking about people who did not have the means to survival. So I think that we could, just presume that it really was, an alarming rate of poverty and an alarming situation that required interventions.
Yeah, so I like that you're bringing in this kind of notion of absolute poverty. I think, too often people fall into the trap of saying, well, obviously someone has to be the poorest person or something like that. But there's a difference between having food and not having food, having a house and not having a house, that kind of thing. That's important. Yeah, let's go to Dan.
Yeah, so one thing that stuck out to me from that quote that Alex brought up was private enterprise is the most efficient form of economic organization, and so it should be the predominant factor. And I think often, in sort of one of the subtexts of this conversation is sort of this dichotomy between efficiency versus effectiveness. And I think that's important because efficiency is a lot of what people talk about in terms of the free market being preferable to something being run by the government. But we have to ask the question, is it the most effective? And I think that's where we might be able to get into, actually disentangling economic policy versus political sort of persuasions, in the sense that, as I've been thinking more about this over the discussion, maybe good economic policy is fairly apolitical. It's sort of, it should be a good thing for everyone. And if it's a good thing for everyone, to me, that means that it's effective, and it's not, that's the sort of guiding principle as opposed to efficient, because it's super efficient for, like, right now. I mean, it's the economy in the US is working fairly well with tens of millions of people out of work. And so the idea that the economy needs a certain amount of people, or we talk about that the economy needs a certain amount of work done. And so and that can be at its most efficient level, but that's ineffective when you're talking about people's living standards if the only way to get money is through a job. And so I just think that effectiveness is what you should always optimize for. And that comes back to sort of my original point of what should be in the private sector, what should be in the public sector. What's the most effective way? What are the most effective things that, what's the most effective way to organize, or how do you organize your society in a way such that the things that are in the public sector are most effective and the things that are in the private sector are most effective? And I don't know, it just seems like we get caught up in the whole ideological stuff, and I just recoil at that.
Yeah, I think it's this question of which resources are most effectively or efficiently allocated by the market versus the government, versus the public sector. And it's not an easy question to answer. And there are people who are debating, where to draw that line all the time. But it's never helpful if someone comes, I'm saying never. It's never helpful if someone comes in and says, oh, it's always better for the market to do things, or it's always better for the government to do things. I think there are some things you can look at and say, well, if the market is working efficiently, then you would want the market to allocate food to people, because if people have money, they're going to buy food for themselves. You don't have to worry about that. Whereas something like healthcare, the incentives are a little bit different, and you might want to have like a centralized pooling of risk and that kind of thing. Or not even healthcare, but something more obvious like the military. You don't want each person to just buy a gun and defend themselves in order to protect the country from foreign invaders. I know there are some people who kind of have a fantasy about that, but that's not a way to organize a military. You're not going to be very effective. So yeah, I think it's important for people to be humble and realize that there's a role for both, and then maybe there's some arguments to be had about which, when it's better to do one or when it's better to do the other. Let's go.
Just quickly, I just think that effectiveness is the most important thing rather than efficiency or anything else. Like, does this work or does this not work?
Yeah, for sure. And if it doesn't work, then it doesn't really matter how efficiently it's not working, because it's not working. Yeah, that's a good point. Let's go to Derek.
Yeah, as we were talking here, I mean, I'm very, very curious about this whole piece of history now as a story, right? Because when we start looking at, well, what was the policy of this regime that came in, and then was it market or public sector heavy? I mean, this is very abstract, but then if we think about like, well, what were the previous policies before? How did it unfold over time? Maybe we can get a clearer idea. I would just sort of very, very briefly looking up what I could. And I guess maybe we need a point of comparison, like what was the economic plan before the Chicago Boys came in? As far as I can tell, there was something called the Vuskovic Plan. And it talks about how under the Allende era, like what the goals were, what kind of policies they were using. And it's really interesting because they talk about a number of different things. I mean, they do talk about nationalization of a lot of the country's resources, nationalization of foreign enterprises that were in the country, which were seen to be sort of parasitizing the economy, breaking up land and redistributing it out to the people, to peasants, they say, and transferring banks and businesses into state property. And then also they talk about massive redistribution of income. Now, they don't say how they were doing that, but presumably it was not basic income, since that did not exist at all. And so what's going on there? So we're breaking up a lot of the productive assets of the economy. We're changing who owns that, and we're changing how that's all working. And then if you're redistributing the income, I mean, is this in terms of what we think of as conditional means tested welfare, and then you're taxing other people too at the same time? So you can see there's a lot of possible problems there. A lot of these things are what I read about in other cases of hyperinflation, Zimbabwe, that sort of thing. And so if you add on top of that, I mean, then the US deciding, right, to interfere with the economy and restrict trade, that's going to add additional pressure on top of that. So I think we can sort of ask ourselves, like, if you were Allende, right, like what would you do if foreign trade dries up, you're left with kind of the economy that you have? How do you prevent this hyperinflationary spiral from developing? Because it takes two, right? There's the foreign external influence or something getting cut off, But at the end of the day, your resources are there. You have resources in the economy, and it's like, how could we have reacted to that? And obviously, I like basic income, but we could also think more generally, maybe thinking about trying to get spending money to consumers and trying to mobilize the resources that you have optimally. If you're getting that hyperinflation, there's something you could be doing, right? You could be doing something to prevent that if you are the currency issuer. So I think that's an earlier part of the story maybe we could think about.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting question. If the United States is coming in and mucking around with your economy, what's the best response to that? And maybe there are certain things that you just have to get by with certain things. You're not as rich. Your economy's access to certain resources is being cut off. Like if you're Iran, you've got these sanctions, and there's some stuff that you just don't have easy access to. So if you're Iran, how do you prevent inflation? And Iran has kind of struggled with this as well. And if you're Allende and you're Chile in the early 1970s, what's your best play? And I think they did not execute their best play. I still think that even Allende, his best bet probably would have been to do something that helped stabilize prices. Like instead of giving everyone more money, admit that you're a little bit poorer because some of your trade is being cut off by the United States, that kind of thing. So you can tighten monetary policy while at the same time implementing something like a basic income and ensuring that nobody has nothing and your society as a whole is a little bit poorer, but you're kind of doing the best you can with what you have. And I don't think he was doing the best he could with what he had. And then you could ask the question, would there have been a military coup? Would the coup have been successful? Would it have kind of persuaded enough people if Allende would have been able to kind of keep his economy kind of stable and robust and that kind of thing, even if it was poorer? And I think if you kind of extrapolate, kind of how you were bringing up, Derek, if you extrapolate what was going on in Chile under the Allende regime, including the interference from the United States, you might end up seeing something similar to what we see today in Venezuela, which also might be partly fueled by interference from the United States as well, but they could be responding better. Yeah.
Yeah, just a quick follow-up to that. I mean, there's a really interesting chart I just found on Wikipedia that shows real wages over Allende's time in power, and the value of real wages just it tanks, right? And of course you're in a much more vulnerable position when that happens. We don't want that to occur. So maybe if the U.S. mess with the economy, there could be a little bit of a tank, but then we can figure out how do we start growing again from whatever position that we're in.
Right, exactly. And part of the problem is that you're kind of approaching things from socialist, command and control economy. You're not allowing the markets to kind of do what they efficiently do. So part of the reason why the United States wanted to overthrow the regime of Chile was related to the fact that they were maybe doing these things wrong, and the United States had a sense of that. Obviously, it was more political than that. They weren't, most people in the United States weren't anti-communist because they were thinking deeply about economic theory. They were anti-communist because that's what it was to be American, and that's what the Americans were doing. So yeah. Let's go to Eddie.
I really like Derek's question about what would you do if the U.S. is messing with your currency, and I think one of the best things that you can do is that you have to realize you have to let the price and the market be your friend. And one of the mistakes that is often made is to try to resist the change in the price. But if you are not able to change the fundamentals of the market, then the price is going to go the way it's supposed to. It's going to go the way it's going to go, no matter what you do. So what you actually want to do is you want to let the price, if it's dropping because of what the U.S. is doing, let it drop, and let it drop hard. Do nothing, let it drop. Eventually, it will reach a very low price, and at some point, there are negative feedback loops in economics, where where the price gets low enough, then people become incentivized to buy the currency. to get back in. That happened even during the Weimar story. There was actually there were actually stages of it, and there were stages where it went down so far, and then people said, okay, the price is really low, and Germany's futures is better than that, so we should get in, and it started spiking. So you want to let the price go down. You want to stabilize it after it drops.
So I just want to be clear. It took me like a minute to figure out what you were talking about, but you're talking about the price of the currency in the foreign exchange markets.
Yes,
so
exactly.
You're talking about letting the currency depreciate until it gets low enough that people want to start buying it again.
Exactly. Then you hit it hard to stabilize it at the low price. It's actually a good thing. It's actually easing. It's actually stimulus to your domestic economy when the price of your currency is lower. Because if the price of your currency is lower, then everything that you export. Now the U.S. may be stopping you from stopping a lot of people from buying from you, but the 10% that still buy from you, when your currency is down 50%, then everything is 50% off. For everybody else in the world, and that's very stimulative for the economy. So you let it drop, you stabilize it at the deep part, and then the other thing that you have to do is over time, you will want to build up a reserve of gold and maybe other other currencies. It doesn't matter if your currency becomes much cheaper. It only matters the change if it keeps getting cheaper and cheaper and cheaper. You want it to get really cheap and then stay there, and that's what you want. Just the stability. It doesn't matter that the price went down a lot from before. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think what you want for your domestic economy is you want your domestic price level to be stable, and of course that's connected to foreign exchange and whether your currency is depreciating or appreciating or that kind of thing. But if the United States is interfering with your exports, then hypothetically there's a way to take advantage of that. You still have this productive capacity, and you're not selling it overseas. That means there should be a way to feed that production back into your own economy. Now, maybe you're producing wheat or copper, more copper and wheat than your economy really needs, and the way you make up for that is by trading internationally, and you have to sell the wheat and buy the other stuff that your economy uses. So maybe in some sense your imports depend on exporting stuff because you're so specialized. But it feels to me like if your currency is depreciating, a lot of countries are competing to depreciate their currencies to kind of boost their exports. I guess you have a situation in Chile where exports are down and your currency is depreciating at the same time. But there's no my point is that you have resources that are not being tapped into, and if they're not being tapped into internationally, then if you have something like a basic income, that's a way to activate more of your resources domestically, because people's incomes don't depend on selling things to foreign countries, but also you're not really able to sell things to foreign countries. So you can have people's incomes come into them and then they can buy things domestically. It feels like there's,
Yeah, absolutely. There was one other thing I wanted to say, which is that I think it's a huge trap. It's very hard to avoid with this subject matter. Avoid looking at economics from a political perspective, but I think there's a better way, which is to look at politics from an economic perspective. And there's an idea that a lot of what drives politics is the interplay between the populace, which is generally poor, and the elite, and generally. You actually, people think of the left and the right as the poor and the rich, but generally what happens is that the left and the right are both elite phenomena. Generally, what you end up usually is you have in certain circumstances where the elite have been doing very well, but then they start having a harder time. You end up with the elite, kind of becoming more partisan, becoming more divided, and one part is playing the right game, and one part is playing the left game. And the left game, part of the left game is to is to pull the populists along with you. But I think there are examples that show that even when the left wins in the end, the populist doesn't actually win. That it's a game. It's kind of a cynical political game where there a little bit it's just storytelling, and there's a little bit where the left only simply uses the populist but doesn't actually end up helping them. And I think that one of the things that is important to do to balance, to counteract that, to actually help the populace, one of the things that you have to do is to build nuance into it. And because we're reaching the point in history where, you know, the populace is relatively a little bit more educated than in the past, you know, you want to, instead of having it be where like you either go left with your whole story or you either go right with your whole story. You want to build a movement. You know, Andrew Yang was right with the not left, not right, forward, where you look at which parts of the left ideology's story is actually correct.
I'm gonna interrupt you,
which part of the right
Eddie. Yeah, I'm gonna interrupt you, and I think part of the point that you're trying to make is that if you have a populist movement that ends up winning, a lot of times they don't necessarily understand what they're fighting for, and they end up worse off in the end. And that's true whether it's left populist, right populist. But if you have kind of smart people thinking deeply and making decisions, then maybe you can get better outcomes for people. I think that's mainly the kind of the point you're getting at, right?
Yeah. Well, the trouble is that you end up with smart people on the top who in the end kind of work for themselves. And what you really want is you want the entire populace working for themselves, and you want them to actually look at both stories and say, you know,
so if the populace gets smarter, then they'll actually be able to fight for the things that make everybody better off.
Exactly.
I think that's a great point. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Let's go to Kevin.
Yeah. So I would like to actually respond to some of the points that some of the other people made. So I think starting with Dan, I really liked how you brought up discussion of, you know, again, what's public versus private. So I think we often, again, kind of related to Eddie's point on the fact that, you know, the populace should get smarter. I mean, yes, if people got smarter, everything would work out nicely. Democracy will be a perfect thing. But again, that kind of relates to, I think, the public sector versus private sector arguments a little bit. Again, a lot of people are always focused on, public sector, this should be private sector. But to a certain extent, I mean, that's just completely futile, right? Because you have to look at specific things, like even broadly, even defining education should be private or public. I feel like that's too broad, that's too general. And I mean, like different economists, different academics, intellectuals make different arguments based on different assumptions and different models on which is more effective and efficient. But again, I think that also kind of relates to the idea of, you know, what's your goal? What's your end game? Is it to maximize GDP to a certain extent? Is it to maximize GDP, but given the constraints that you have some sort of equality, whether that means income, wealth, or equality of opportunity? So I think depending on those kind of frameworks, you have to first define a goal and then look at each very specific thing into what should be private, what should be public. I mean, because people make good cases on, I think education is kind of very straightforward, because again, like very simple goals that almost everyone can agree on are, you know, one, you want to propagate certain national values to your kids, to your students. And two, you want your general populace to at least be able to read and at least be able to do simple math, or whatever the line is, the minimum education requirement. So I think that's a simple case, but I think for everything else, it depends on your values, depends on what your end goal is. And again, which I think it's important to define what that end goal is. Because, and I think if your end goal is just maximize GDP as much as, you know, freaking possible, then you're prone to get inequality, because you're not looking at that. But if your end goal is to maximize GDP as much as possible, given that some sort of inequality is met, then you're not going to have too much of it. But again, I mean, it depends on what your preferences are. Can you live with some of the social instability that is caused by inequality, or can you not live with it? So I think that really depends on. And once you define a goal, then you have to look specifically into different options per different segments to really define, okay, which one fits my goal a little better.
Yeah.
But I think that then also, again, brings up, kind of connects to Eddie's point of the general populace. I think in a democratic system, people vote, right? So people have to be aware of their goals, and there has to be some national value. I always think democracy is working when people agree on what the goal is, but don't agree on the methods. So I think that's a good place, because people are likely to have, civil discussion, constructive discussions, and they're gonna people are gonna build their own models, and then they're gonna debate and argue about it, and then whatever stands the test of time should be implemented. But then comes the issue of when the people aren't, again, really educated, or when people aren't aware. People, nowadays, somebody said, social media is a nuance destruction machine, where nuance is absolutely destroyed, and people can't distinguish two arguments from each other. Well, even though they look similar, but they're very different arguments. When people can't distinguish those two, then obviously I feel like those goals drift away, and now you get all sorts of crazy people kind of running around saying crazy things.
So I think you're bringing up an important point, which is what do we want out of the economy? And do we even all agree on what we want out of the economy? And if you ask someone what they want, are they talking about their ultimate goal, or are they talking about something they think is a way of achieving kind of a goal that we all agree on? And I think most people agree that we want humanity to be maximally prosperous, and we don't want poverty and all of that kind of stuff. But people might be thinking of more like direct intermediate steps of how to get there, and they might be disagreeing about those steps, and then you can start to talk about that. But when you start, and economics is a funny thing, because it's like the only field where Nobel Prize winners can disagree with each other kind of completely about something, and think the other one is an idiot and completely wrong, and that kind of thing. So it's certainly it's either something that we haven't solved yet, or it's something that some people have solved and other people don't recognize it, and we're not implementing. So yeah, it's a very interesting area for discussion. So I want to get to the next quote from the article, which will probably actually be our last one, and we can get to the people who have their hands up. So let's see. But the most dramatic result of the economic policies has been the rise in unemployment. Before the coup, unemployment in Chile was 3.1%, one of the lowest in the Western Hemisphere. By the end of 1974, the jobless rate had climbed beyond 10% in the Santiago metropolitan area, and was also higher in several other sections of the country. Official junta and IMF figures show that by the end of 1975, unemployment in the Santiago metropolitan area had reached 18.7%. The corresponding figure in other parts of the country was more than 22%. And in specific sectors, such as the construction industry, it had reached almost 40%. Unemployment has continued to climb in 1976. And according to the most conservative estimates, in July, approximately 2.5 million Chileans, about 1/4 of the population, had no income at all. They survived thanks to the food and clothing distributed by church and other humanitarian organizations. So this is very interesting for the topic of basic income, because basic income is a way of providing money to people that's independent of the labor market. So when we're thinking about things from a basic income perspective, maybe we don't care as much about unemployment levels, whether people happen to have jobs or not, because we can start to think about the labor market as just a market for allocating labor. And if it's operating efficiently, then it'll hire people as needed. And if it doesn't hire people, that's fine too, because there wasn't work that needed doing that we needed to hire people for. So it's interesting how his framing has kind of these built-in assumptions of how the economy is kind of supposed to work. And I think we have these assumptions today. Like this is something that if you read about a recession or something like that, one of the biggest things is the unemployment. If you when people are arguing about how to identify that a recession is happening as soon as possible without like a lot of times you have to wait 6 months or a year, and then they declare that, oh, the recession actually started back then or something like that. But then people say, oh, but if you look at the employment numbers, you can figure it out sooner and that kind of thing. Well, if you have a basic income, all of that is kind of out the window because the employment levels aren't really related to how people get their money to be able to buy things anymore. So that's just kind of something to keep in mind with that quote. And a few people have their hands up. Let's go to Austin.
Okay, so I'm going to go right back to where I sort of dropped off, because the first thing you said after that was, well, let's talk about the economic stuff separate to politics, and then the example that came up was inflation, right? So when I was in Lebanon in 2006, a war broke out. So what happened was there was
we kind of lost your audio there, Austin.
Have you got me now?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. So I was talking about in Lebanon in 2006, I was there at the start of the war, and as soon as the first bomb dropped, the currency changed. So there'd been no real damage done to the productive capacity of the economy. There'd been nothing real done. All that had happened was the political faith in the government. So when you're talking about inflation in the Allende government, to me, I'm like, well, I don't know how much we can I don't know how much we can learn by looking at that example as from an economic point of view, because we don't know how much of the effect is political and how much of the effect is economic. And then you and Derek were talking about, what are the paths they could have taken given these circumstances to better manage the system, including the pressure. And when you were describing those paths, both of them to me seemed to hit political dead ends. So one was, the CMT calibrated basic income approach, which would be my, which I would agree with as a general principle of what we should be doing now. What people should have done then would have been a good idea. But that would have been a thing, so you said, you rein in monetary policy and you give people a basic income. So even if the country gets a little bit poorer, nobody misses out. But then you lose the support of the middle class, right? You lose the support of the middle class because their incomes are going down even faster. And so that's the sort of swing vote. A lot of the time it's, we're describing it was described as a two-class struggle, right? By Eddie a little while ago. A lot of the time what actually happens is that there's what happened, the dominant group has a class coalition. So either the poor and the middle class against the rich, or the rich and the middle class against the poor, or the very rich and the poor against the middle class. This is often a winning alliance, 2-on-1, right? And so what happens in places like Allende's Chile is that you lose the middle class. So even like there were truck drivers on strike. In a country like that, a truck driver is lower middle class, right? So you've got the middle class sided with the conservative and the wealthy factions. And all of the policies you were describing, which I would agree with as good economic policies, wouldn't have been politically viable. The politically viable option, if we set the goals for the policy outcomes, right? The outcomes, you want to prevent poverty, keep people alive and fed and not starving and cold, right? Keep kids in school, all of that good stuff, and maintain your government's power, right? If these are your two goals, then the actual route to take is the Cuba route. Do what Cuba did and just embrace the Soviet Union. Say, yeah, fuck it. We are communists. Fuck democracy. Fuck everything. We're going to be part of the socialist bloc. And I would argue that it was actually what Allende did was, he was a constitutionalist. He believed in a constitutional democratic route, and he thought it was better to fail taking that route than to succeed by taking the authoritarian route. And so I wonder how much, I think if you're looking at Chile, the lesson that can be taken from Chile is the lesson that was taken from Chile by right-wing governments all around the world, which was, here's how you do it. Here's how you stop a center-left government modernizing your country, because you don't want to modernize it. You are like a feudal lord with people kissing your feet and bowing and scraping for the scraps from your table. And if you want to keep it like that, the way to do it is you kill all the, you kill the leaders, you round them up, and don't worry, we've got your back. The international press will tell a story about an economic miracle and how great things are going now that the communists are being defeated. The United States government will back you. That's the lesson from Chile. And trying to draw economic lessons from what's going on without a really grounded understanding of those power dynamics, I think can lead to misleading conclusions. And that can be my final thought too. You don't need to come back to me. I'm done.
Okay. So I think yes. I think there are a few different lessons we can draw from Chile, and certainly if we don't understand some of the lessons, it's going to distort what we get out of other lessons and that kind of thing. I think that's right. And there's this huge political aspect to it, and I don't want to pretend like that's not there. That being said, I do think this is a useful discussion to have. And when we're talking about basic income, we can bring in political stuff there too, right? Like there's, what's basic income in the context of a military dictatorship? Would we want Pinochet to implement a basic income and then become even more popular and more powerful and that kind of thing?
Can I jump in real quickly? I would say the international context would have prevented either Allende or Pinochet from introducing a basic income, and that would have tied in with local politics and the effect on if you bring in a basic income, that is some inflationary pressure, and you have to take that out somewhere else, right? So they would have had to be less generous to some other part of the economy, or to international players, right? It's got to come from the spending. The money doesn't have to come from somewhere, but the spending power does. As you know, so
so it depends. If your economy is inefficient and there are resources that are going unused and you're operating below capacity, then there's a little bit of free lunch there that you can kind of pick up. But generally speaking, I think what you're saying is right.
Free lunch for the economy as a whole, not free lunch for all the sectors in it. And what you're trying to do is balance these various competing sectors.
Right. Let's go to Bethany.
Yeah, I think this ties into what we've been talking about, but it just seems like in thinking about the different systems that have been used, it's hard for any of them to maximize both of two things. You have kind of like the total size of the pot, like how much growth and production there is, and maybe and it looks like from Chile that some of the policies that they implemented under Pinochet was helpful for growing the size of the pot, but the distribution problem was maybe got worse, right? Because as you mentioned, like people weren't getting their incomes from jobs as much, and so and as Diane mentioned, then poverty went up quite a bit. And then under the previous ruler, it seemed like maybe the size of the pot was smaller, if I'm interpreting what people have been saying correctly, and wasn't able to grow as well, and maybe in part because you don't have economy of scale if you're dividing up all the farms into small farms and this kind of thing, but at the same time, they had some better distribution of sort of basic resources. And this kind of seems like a theme. I'm not by any means the first one to say this, but this just kind of seems like a theme of different systems kind of failing on or falling short of the ideal on one or the other of those. And in terms of basic income, I personally feel that can, or the way you certainly talk about it, is that the reason that some of the systems that are good at growing the pot fall short on distribution is that they don't really have a good way to distribute, and basic income can be that way without maybe having to sacrifice as much of the size of the pot as you sacrifice under other systems that are maybe more inefficient, like disallowing some of the incentives that create a big pot because no one can sort of own and grow a business very well, or breaking up economy of scale so you can't have a big pot that way. Those things seem less optimal, because if you have a big pot and a good distribution, obviously everybody's better off. So that's kind of where I see basic income coming in to sort of help with this conundrum that I haven't really seen any system, not that any system is perfect, but I haven't seen any system totally solve this well. I think we do kind of do it now with a sort of hodgepodge of things, but obviously in places like the US or Europe, but not as well as maybe we could.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. If you're the government and you're trying to take over industry to, kind of control everything, then you're going to lose incentives and you're going to lose efficiency. But if you can orient the market the profit motive toward distributing to more people more effectively, then you've got that motive there, and you've got people wanting to produce things for their own profit, and you've got them wanting to do it for the benefit of everyone if the people are the ones with the money. So I think that's a really excellent point. So let's go around and get people's final thoughts. We'll start with Richard, and then we'll go to Kevin, and then Derek.
From what I've seen, the purpose of education is to get people to be capable of fulfilling whatever position they're interested in the economy, but not to have enough the capacity for critical thought at the end of the day, because they're too tired to actually analyze anything that's happening. And how this goes into the.
So I'm gonna have to interrupt you, Richard, because your audio is really kind of crackling up. But I think what you're saying is that the way we've structured our education system is kind of geared towards people being able to kind of participate as cogs in the machine. But it's the way it is now, it's not really towards helping people fulfill their higher purpose or something like that. And maybe it could be. There's kind of a side chat going on in the chat right now where people are talking about education and the purpose of education. Do we want it to be preparing people for jobs and that kind of thing? We did one of these discussions a while back on education, so you guys might want to check that one out if you haven't seen it yet. So let's go to Kevin, Derek, and then Eddie.
Sorry, I just want to make sure. I don't think I have my hand raised.
No, we're just going around getting people's final thoughts to get to the end here.
Yeah, so I think we've discussed. I think a lot of different people have touched on a lot of different points, which I think it's important because it's good to hear it from a variety of perspectives and variety of angles. So I think in final thoughts, I'm trying to come up with one right now on the spot. So I think essentially I want everyone to know that, and again, I don't know what educational backgrounds everyone has, how many books people usually read, how familiar they are with economics and economic theory and the nuances of how economists argue things. So I think it's never clear cut. It's never about, it's never black and white. It's never this versus that. It's always about what assumptions you make, and given those assumptions, what are certain conclusions you can make given the data and given some kind of critical thinking and some type of logic, as well as I think people are never arguing. People should never really argue about this guy's bad, this guy's good. But you have to be complex about it. This guy is people and policies, government administrations, they're all complex. And certainly you have to look at them discretely on the specific things they did and judge them discretely. It's like, Pinochet, terrible military dictator, he ought to be, criticized for all the military dictatorship that he thinks did. But maybe there are certain policies in there that he did do well. Because Chile is one of the most thriving nations in South America. That's undeniable. Their middle class is fairly robust. That's undeniable. And I think even the poverty, you have to kind of look at it from the right metrics. So maybe that poverty increase was temporary. Maybe that was the cost of getting the economy on track. Again, I'm not saying that's true. Maybe that was the case, or maybe that wasn't, and maybe they made a lot of mistakes and they fixed that later on, because some reputable sources say their poverty rate has decreased quite significantly. So people, I think it's important to, again, look at the right metrics and even to question. Because people come up with, I think one of the biggest myths is like, oh, inequality. When people are talking about equality, it has increased in the United States, but people are oftentimes using the wrong, extremely wrong metrics, because saying top X% of the wealth is held by the top Y%. I think those are extremely wrong metrics to look at. So I just want to point that out. And I think that having that kind of thought in mind, I think applies to everything, especially in this conversation.
Yeah, I think that's it's good to have that kind of more open-minded perspective. You don't want to judge things in black and white, or you're not going to understand it in a more nuanced way. Let's go to Derek, and then Eddie, and then Martin.
Towards the beginning of this discussion, Alex, as a side note, mentioned that Friedman supported a negative income tax, which is sort of very similar to basic income, closest thing to a basic income that is talked about from monetarists, but mentioned that he thought that he saw it as a way to consolidate, eventually as a way to consolidate sort of the social systems that existed and to transition to a world where you didn't need the negative income tax, where you could sort of take that away after you've achieved this thriving private sector that he imagined. Just, from a really cursory glance, I need to look more into it, but it's interesting that in the Allende government, apparently their view of the income redistribution that they were doing was similar, that they thought that this was a sort of a transitional measure that they were using to win support of the public so they could then bring the economy into a kind of socialist state, a direction. That was what was their vision. I think it's so fascinating that for both these totally polar opposite economic views of the world, they both had this similar feeling, this kind of ancillary, as a side note, we're okay, and maybe we'll get some income to people. And when we think about what is the goal of the economy, how do we measure how the economy is doing for people? What is this optimal measure of performance? I think the frustrations we see on both sides of divides like this make a lot of sense. What good is high GDP if there's also high poverty? What good is high employment if real wage purchasing power is extremely low? And I think a great way to cut through this is to find the measure that actually is appropriate, not GDP, not wages or employment, but consumer purchasing power. And so, towards that end, I think maybe if we want to figure out a way to get past these political fights that have such tragic consequences, I think maybe that's a good place to start, is figuring out what is a metric we can all agree on that actually measures real economic prosperity for everyone. And maybe that will solve some of our problems.
Yeah, I like that. Real consumer purchasing power among whoever happens to be the poorest consumers. I think that's a good metric. Let's go Eddie, Martin, and then Dan.
So I think that kind of game theory, you want both sides to be, the two sides are competing against each other, and you want them to compete against each other and compete for your support. So if you were Allende, I think what he managed to do a little bit was to piss off the oligarchs on the right, but he was also trying to appease them and trying to distance himself from the communists on the left a little bit. So he didn't have fully, Cuba and the Soviet Union's help on the left either. And you want to do the opposite of that. You want to, say, you want to try to be friends with the U.S. as much as possible and say, oh, we have common ground here, and also try to be friends with the Soviet Union and the communists and say, oh, we all want to help the lower classes. So, how can we work together and try to get the two competing against each other for your support? And I think the populists,
right,
in a democratic country should also do the same thing.
Okay, let's go to Martin, and then Dan, and then Bethany.
So hopefully everybody can hear me. The headset battery gave up. As a guy with an education in Soviet studies and revolutionary warfare and counterinsurgency, I look at questions like this, and I'm struck by how from the outside it's really easy to oversimplify. Maybe I don't have a right to say that, but I will say that when you dig into all these stories, they prove to be immensely more complicated than when one has just really a high level discussion. Doesn't mean you shouldn't have a high level discussion. It's just, well, like I've said before, it's always good to have a little bit of humility because things tend to be more complicated than they appear, depending how high up you're looking down.
Yep, I think that's a good point. Let's go to Dan, Bethany, and then Diane.
Yeah, nothing specific. It's a good conversation. I think we navigated the landmines pretty well. So thanks, everyone.
All right, let's go to Bethany and then Diane.
Hey, yeah, I have kind of like two questions as my closing thought. One is the question I raised at the beginning, which is what was different or similar about what happened in the US that was seen as inspired by what happened in Chile? And the other is kind of what was sort of missing in the theory, or why did say the Milton Friedmans and the Chicago boys not anticipate things like the unemployment? Like, in what ways would their theories have predicted something different, and why didn't that happen when they implemented things in Chile?
Great questions. Let's go to Diane. Final thoughts.
I was just wondering. I was wondering how they're doing now. If we know how they're doing now, and maybe that can give us a little bit more hindsight as to whether what happened, what effects it really had.
Yeah, so you might be interested to find out that Chile erupted in mass protests back in October, and a lot of the cities were on military lockdown, and this kind of continued until coronavirus hit. And now they're due to have a constitutional convention and a restructuring of their constitution. So they're still not out of it. And a lot of people are tracing the problems that they're having now. It's protests about inequality and all of that kind of stuff. A lot of people are tracing that back to the Chicago boys and what happened under Pinochet in the 1970s. So I think that's a really important point to kind of end this conversation on. This is a great discussion, you guys. Next week, we have 7 featured guests. Diane is one of them, and Derek is another one. And then we also have Carl Widerquist and Michael Lewis and who are the other ones? Oh, here we go. We have Conrad Shaw and Alma Zalecki and Kate McFarland, who wrote a really interesting article. And we're going to be talking about the power to say no. So the question is going to be, does basic income cause people to stop working, and does it matter? So it's going to be a discussion among the kind of the featured guests, and then we'll get to questions from everyone else in kind of the second hour. And also, it's going to be the first of our basic income discussions, of Boston Basic Income discussions, that is going to be syndicated as a podcast on the various podcasting platforms. So starting next week, we are going to be a podcast. I mean, it's going to be the same as it always is, but people who are listening on podcasts can now listen to our discussions. All right, thanks, guys.
Yo, you gotta start paying us.
Start paying me, man.
Once they start paying him,
Yeah, that's true.
Do we have to sign some kind of contracts or something?
No.